They laughed at his $50 junk Farmall. What he found inside 18 years later changed everything. The first thing people say when they hear this story is that he got lucky. And maybe that's the easiest way to explain it. Luck, coincidence, being in the right place at the right time, the universe deciding that one particular man on one particular Tuesday morning deserved something that most people spend their whole lives working toward and never find. But that's not what happened. Not really. What happened was this. A man paid $50 for a tractor that everyone else had already decided was worthless. And then he did something that almost nobody does anymore. He paid attention. Part 1. The Auction. The Meer farm sale was held on a Thursday in October of 1987 out on County Road 14, about 7 miles east of Defiance, Ohio. It was the kind of sale that turns up in every farming community every few years. The kind that draws a crowd not because anybody's getting rich, but because there's history going out the lane, and people want to see what it brings or what it doesn't. Earl Meer had farmed that ground since 1951. Started with 60 acres his father left him and built it slowly to just under 200, the way men did in those years. Patient, deliberate, one field at a time. He'd been a careful man about most things, Earl. Paid his bills, kept his fences. But his equipment decisions had been made in a different era and at a different pace than the neighbors around him, and by the time he retired in the fall of 1987 at age 73, what sat in his equipment line was a mixed collection of iron that ranged from serviceable to questionable to, in the eyes of most people at that sale, genuinely hopeless. The Farmall was in the last category. It was a 1955 Farmall 400 diesel. If you know that tractor, you know it was one of the better machines International Harvester put out in the mid-50s. Good-sized row crop tractor, around 47 horsepower on the drawbar, a 4-cylinder engine that was solid and proven, wide adjustable front axle on the wide front versions. But this one had not had an easy life. The sheet metal was rough. Front hood with a crease somebody had tried to straighten and hadn't quite, left fender cracked through at the mounting bracket, the right rear fender gone entirely, replaced at some point with a piece of welded angle iron that served the purpose without much commitment to aesthetics. The paint was nearly gone, faded to a dull brick red ghost of the original IH red, peeling and rusted in patches. The seat was split open and had a burlap sack stuffed into the gap. It sat at the end of the line like the last kid picked for a team. Mud-cake tires, one front wheel slightly out of plumb where the spindle had taken a hit at some point and never been properly realigned. The auctioneer got to it near the end of the day, by which time most of the serious buyers had already hauled out what they'd come for, and the crowd had thinned to the curious and the stubborn. He announced it as a 1955 Farmall 400 diesel, runs and works, though nobody present had seen it run that day, and at least 2 men near the back were quietly betting it didn't. The bidding opened at $100. Nobody bid. The auctioneer tried $75. Still nothing. He went to $50, and a man in the back, standing near the fence wearing a canvas work coat with a cracked elbow, drinking cold coffee from a thermos lid, raised his hand. Nobody else moved. $50, the auctioneer said, with the particular tone auctioneers use when the number embarrasses them. Going once, going twice. The gavel came down. The man who bought it was named Walter Grubb. He was 34 years old, farmed 83 acres he'd inherited from his uncle 2 years earlier, and had exactly enough money in his checking account to make the $50 purchase without bouncing anything. He didn't have a trailer that day. He'd walked in from a pickup parked a quarter-mile down the road, figuring he wouldn't buy anything that required hauling. He ended up borrowing a trailer from a neighbor at the sale, who lent it to him with the particular expression of a man who is trying not to laugh. "What are you going to do with that thing?" the neighbor asked. "Fix it," Walter said. The neighbor nodded slowly. He'd heard that before. "What are you going to do with it after that?" "Use it," Walter said, which was apparently the wrong answer, because the neighbor laughed despite himself and shook his head all the way back to his truck. Walter drove the Farmall 400 home on the borrowed trailer that afternoon, parked it in his own barn, returned the trailer, and went inside for supper. After supper, he went back to the barn with a trouble light and looked the tractor over for the first time without a crowd around. He'd bought it on instinct, not a bad instinct, because Walter Grubb was a man who understood machines and could read an engine the way some people read faces. But he hadn't had time at the sale to really assess it. He assessed it now. The engine was seized. Not seized the way an engine seizes when it's been run without oil. That's usually catastrophic and ugly in ways that make your stomach drop. This was a different kind of seized, a stationary kind. The kind that happens when a machine has been sitting for years and corrosion has worked its way into the cylinder walls and rings and bonded them together with the particular stubbornness of rust. It was a problem, but it was a solvable problem. The fuel system was a mess. Tank had some water in it. Injectors were certainly gummed, or worse. The fuel lines were cracked at 2 of the fittings. The hydraulic system needed work. The electrical system needed everything, but the block was not cracked. He checked carefully with a flashlight in the dim barn and found no hairlines. The crankshaft turned when he put a bar to it and applied enough force, which meant the seizure wasn't as deep as it could be. The head looked intact. The injection pump was an unknown but showed no obvious external damage. He made a list on the back of a feed store receipt he found in his coat pocket. It was a long list. But none of it was unfixable. He went to bed that night and slept well, which is the thing that separates a man who understands what he's gotten into from a man who doesn't. Part 2. The Education of a Skeptic. The talk around Defiance County that winter was not particularly kind to Walter Grubb. Not that it was cruel. Farming communities aren't usually cruel. They're just honest in the way that people are when they know each other well enough to say what they really think. And what the people around Walter really thought was that he'd done a foolish thing, paid $50 for a tractor that probably wasn't worth the cost of hauling it away, and now had it sitting in his barn, taking up space that could be used for something useful. His neighbor to the west, a man named Dubois, who'd been farming the same ground since before Walter was born, came by in November and looked at the Farmall through the barn door without going in. "How's the project?" Dubois asked. "Coming along," Walter said, which was optimistic because he'd freed the engine by then. Weeks of penetrating oil and patience and careful work, but hadn't gotten it started yet. "You know what parts cost for those old IH diesels?" "I'm finding out," Walter said. Dubois shook his head in the slow, seasoned way of a man who has seen this particular kind of foolishness before and has decided it isn't worth arguing about. "My advice," he said, "is to strip whatever's useful and sell the rest for scrap iron. Get $20 back on your 50. Walter thanked him for the advice. He didn't take it. By January, he had the engine free and turning smoothly. He'd replaced the rings himself in the cold barn, a job that takes patience and knuckle skin and the ability to work with cold hands on cold iron, and he'd done it methodically, the way he did everything. He'd flushed the fuel system, replaced the bad lines, cleaned the injectors as best he could. They'd need proper testing, but they weren't as bad as he'd feared. He'd gotten the tractor to fire in mid-January, rough and smoky at first, then steadier as the new ring seated and the injectors cleared. The first time it ran under its own power, he stood in the barn and listened to it for a long time. The old IH diesel has a particular sound, a steady, deliberate thrum that's different from a gasoline engine, heavier and more methodical, a sound that means business. He'd grown up hearing it on neighbors' farms. It sounded right. He drove it out of the barn on a cold February morning, just around the yard, both hands on the wheel, getting the feel of it. The steering was stiff. The clutch wanted adjustment, but it moved and it steered, and the brakes worked after a fashion. It was a tractor again. His wife, Sandra, watched from the kitchen window. When he came back inside, she asked him what he was going to do with it. "Fix the steering," he said. "Adjust the clutch. Find a right rear fender. Put it to work in the spring." She looked at him for a moment. She was a practical woman, Sandra, which was one of the reasons he'd married her. "Do you think you'll ever get your $50 back out of it?" she asked. Walter poured himself coffee. "I think it'll earn its keep," he said. Sandra went back to whatever she'd been doing. She didn't push further. She'd learned in 2 years of marriage and 34 years of knowing Walter Grubb that when he said something in that particular quiet way, it was because he'd already thought it through. Part 3. What everyone knew and nobody bothered to say. In the spring of 1988, Walter Grubb put the Farmall 400 to work. He planted corn with it that year, pulling a 4-row planter that he'd inherited with the farm, older equipment, but compatible with the 400's PTO and hydraulics once he'd sorted the hydraulic system. He cultivated with it. He did custom field work for 2 neighbors who were short on tractor time that spring, charging a fair rate and showing up when he said he would, which is not as common a virtue as it should be. The 400 performed. Not spectacularly. It was a 47-horsepower tractor in a world that had moved on to 80 and 120 and more. But it was reliable and it was paid for, and those 2 things together are worth more than most people account for in their equipment decisions. Dubois saw it in the field one afternoon in June, pulling the cultivator through a field of corn that was coming in straight and even, and he stopped his truck on the road and watched for a while. He didn't say anything to Walter about it, but he stopped and watched, which meant something. The second year, 1989, Walter used it again. Same tasks, same results. The tractor was finding its place in the operation, not the biggest thing on the farm, not the machine he used for the heavy fall field work, but a reliable mid-sized workhorse for everything that didn't require maximum horsepower. He found a right rear fender at an implement salvage yard in Paulding County for $12. He welded the left fender crack himself. He didn't repaint it. By 1990, the story of the $50 tractor had mostly faded from the local conversation. People had moved on to other things to talk about. The Gulf situation, the price of corn, who was buying what ground, the usual rotation of topics that farming communities cycle through. The Farmall 400 had become simply one of Walter's tractors, unremarkable by virtue of having proven itself useful, which is the most any machine can aspire to. Walter continued to work on it in small ways over the years, replaced bearings when they showed wear, rebuilt the injection pump in 1992, a job he did himself using a kit he ordered from a dealer in Indiana, and a service manual he'd found at a farm sale. Replaced the seat with a proper cushioned unit he found at an implement auction for $8. Fixed the front wheel alignment. Repainted it in 1994. Not a show paint job, but a clean coat of IH red that covered the rust and sealed the metal. The tractor looked presentable by then. Not new, but honest. And through all of this, the work, the seasons, the gradual improvement, Walter Grubb was paying attention to something that nobody else seemed to notice. Something small. Something that had been there the whole time. Part 4. The numbers. Here is the thing about a 1955 Farmall 400 that most people don't carry around in their heads, because most people have no reason to. International Harvester built the Farmall 400 from 1954 through 1956. Total production was somewhere in the neighborhood of 22,000 tractors over those 3 years. Not rare by any standard. Common enough that they show up regularly at farm sales and in the back of equipment yards and in barns across the Midwest where they've been sitting since the 60s or 70s, gradually being converted by time and rust into the kind of machinery that nobody wants at any price. But within that production run, there were variations. Different configurations, different equipment packages, different serial number ranges that correspond to different production years and factories. And some of those variations, purely by virtue of what they were and how many were made, are more interesting to certain people than others. Walter had noticed the serial number on his 400 in the first week he owned it, standing in the barn with the trouble light. He'd written it down on the same feed store receipt where he'd made his repair list. He hadn't known what to do with it at the time, so he'd looked it up in a production guide he found at a library in Defiance, an old IH production reference that was probably 20 years out of date even then, and confirmed that his tractor had been assembled at the East Moline plant in the early part of the 1955 production run. He'd noted it, filed it away, gone on with the work. But over the years, as he read farm magazines and occasionally stumbled across articles about antique tractor collecting, a hobby that was growing through the late 80s and 90s, driven by the generation of men who'd grown up on these machines and were now prosperous enough to pursue nostalgia with checkbooks, he started to understand something. The early 1955 production Farmall 400s built in the first few months of that model year at East Moline had a peculiarity. A production change had been implemented partway through the 1955 model year that altered several components. Nothing dramatic from an operational standpoint, but meaningful from a collector standpoint because it changed the specification of what came before it. early production 1955 400s, before the change, had specific characteristics that distinguished them from the rest of the run. Walter's tractor was an early production 1955 unit. He also noticed, around 1993 or 1994, that the engine serial number on his tractor didn't quite match what he expected for a standard production Farmall 400. The number was in the right range, but the suffix indicated something he couldn't immediately explain. He wrote to International Harvester's Historical Records Office, which by that point was being maintained by Case IH following the merger, and got back a letter 6 weeks later that was politely informative without being entirely clear. What the letter said, in the careful language of corporate historical archives, was that the engine installed in his tractor appeared to be from a limited production batch assembled for a specific dealer demonstration program in the upper Midwest during the 1955 model year. These engines had been built to a slightly tighter specification than standard production units as part of a program to showcase the reliability of the new diesel line to skeptical buyers who were still transit-sting from gasoline power. There were, the letter said, records indicating that approximately 47 such tractors had been assembled with these demonstration specification engines and distributed through select dealers in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Walter read that letter 3 times. Then he put it in a folder with his other tractor documents and went out to check on the spring planting. He didn't tell anybody, not yet. He wasn't sure what he had, and he wasn't a man who talked about things he wasn't sure about. Part 5. 18 years. The years moved the way years do on a working farm, measured in plantings and harvests, in good prices and bad ones, in the slow accumulation of improvement and the occasional setback that tests whether you've built a foundation solid enough to absorb it. Walter's farm grew, not fast, not dramatically. He picked up a 12-acre parcel in 1991 when a neighbor needed to liquidate quickly, added another 30 acres in 1995, renting at first and then purchasing when the owner decided to retire and offered him right of first refusal on the sale. By the early 2000s, he was farming just under 140 acres, still a small operation by the standards of what farming had become, but a solid and productive one. The Farmall 400 was still in his barn, still running, still working, though its role had shifted as the farm grew and newer equipment was added. By 2002 or 2003, it was doing mostly lighter work, pulling the grain wagon during harvest, handling odd jobs around the place, moving equipment when a second tractor was needed. The big field work had moved to larger machines, but Walter maintained it. He was that kind of man about his equipment. He maintained things, not because he was sentimental, but because he believed that a machine that works for you deserves to be kept working, and that letting something deteriorate through neglect is a kind of wastefulness he had no patience for. He checked the oil. He greased the fittings. He addressed small problems before they became large ones. In 2003, he had a conversation at a farm show in Van Wert that changed the direction of things. He'd been walking through the antique tractor display. They had a section at the show every year, a row of restored and original machines that drew a crowd of men who'd grown up on them, when he got into a conversation with a man who was a serious collector. Retired from what Walter could gather. Had a dozen or so tractors, mostly IH, spanning several decades. Knew the mark the way some people know baseball statistics, dates, serial ranges, production numbers, variations. Walter mentioned, casually, that he had a 1955 Farmall 400 diesel at home. The collector asked a few questions. Year, early or late production, configuration. Walter answered. The collector's questions became more specific, and Walter answered those too, from memory, because he'd spent 15 years paying attention to his tractor, and the information was simply there when he needed it. The collector went quiet for a moment in a way that Walter noted. "Do you know about the East Moline early production variation?" the collector asked. Walter said he'd read something about it. The collector looked at him over the top of his glasses. "Have you had your engine serial number checked against the demonstration program records?" Walter said he'd written to Case IH Records in the 90s and received a letter. The collector was quiet again. Then he said, "I'd like to come see your tractor." Walter told him he was welcome to. The collector came out the following Saturday. He brought a reference book and a small notebook and spent 3 hours with the Farmall 400 in Walter's barn, checking numbers, measuring dimensions, examining components with the focused attention of a man who knows exactly what he's looking for and is finding most of it. At the end of 3 hours, the collector sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and looked at Walter. "I want to tell you something," he said. "And I want you to understand that I'm being straight with you because I could not be straight with you and it would benefit me financially." Walter waited. "What you have here," the collector said, "is one of the 47 early demonstration specification Farmall 400 diesels. I've confirmed it on 3 different identification points. I know of 8 others that have been positively identified and documented. Yours would be the 9th. Walter nodded. "The reason I'm telling you this," the collector said, "is because you're going to be approached by people who know what this is, and some of them are not going to tell you what it's actually worth before they make you an offer." Walter asked what it was actually worth. The collector named a number. It was not $50. Part 6. What Walter did. Walter Grubb was not a man who made quick decisions. He thanked the collector, who left his phone number and said to call if Walter wanted to talk further. Walter put the number in his wallet. He went inside for supper. He told Sandra that the collector had come by and looked at the tractor. She asked what he'd found. Walter told her. Sandra put down the dish she was drying. She turned and looked at him. "How much?" she said. He told her again. She sat down at the kitchen table. After a moment, she said, "Are you going to sell it?" Walter poured himself a glass of water. He stood at the sink and looked out the window at the barn. The barn light was on. He'd left it on when he came in. And the Farmall 400 was in there in the light, the same tractor it had always been, the same iron he'd bought for $50 at the Meer sale in October of 1987, fixed in the cold that winter, and run for the better part of 16 years across his fields and his neighbors' fields and the slow accumulation of a working life. "I don't know yet," he said. He thought about it for 6 months. During those 6 months, he did 2 things. First, he had the tractor professionally evaluated by an IH historian connected to a collector organization in Illinois, who confirmed everything the first collector had said and added additional documentation that strengthened the provenance. Second, he quietly talked to 3 people he trusted: his accountant, a friend who'd sold a piece of farmland and understood the tax implications of a significant transaction, and Sandra, who counted as several advisors in one. He also drove the tractor one more time. A Saturday in June just around the farm, no implement attached. He drove the lane to the backfield and sat there with the engine running, looking at the corn coming up in the rows he'd planted, the same ground he'd worked this machine over for going on 17 years. The diesel engine did what it always did, thumped along steady and deliberate, no drama, no complaint. He thought about the $50. He thought about Dubois telling him to scrap it for 20. He thought about the auction crowd watching him put his hand up on the worst tractor in the line. He thought about the cold barn in January of 1988 and the trouble light and the feed store receipt with the serial number written on the back. He thought, "I paid attention. That's all I did. I paid attention to something that everyone else had already decided wasn't worth looking at." He drove back to the barn, parked the tractor, shut off the engine, and climbed down. He decided to sell it. Not because he needed the money, though he didn't not need it, but because the tractor deserved to be documented and preserved properly, and he wasn't a collector. He was a farmer. He'd used the 400 for what it was meant to be used for, and used it well, and now it had become something different, something that belonged in a collection where its history would be recorded and maintained. That felt right to him. He called the first collector and told him he was ready to talk. They negotiated for 2 weeks respectfully, the way men negotiate when both of them know what something is worth, and neither of them is trying to take advantage of the other. They reached a number that was fair to both of them. The sale closed on a Tuesday in October of 2005, 18 years, almost to the month, from the day he'd bought it. Part 7. What it came out to. The math, when Walter actually sat down with his accountant and worked it through, came out to something that was hard to put into plain language without it sounding like bragging, which was not something Walter Grubb had a taste for. Here's what he'd put in: $50 at the auction. Parts over 18 years, engine rings, bearings, the injection pump rebuild kit, miscellaneous fittings and hoses and filters, the rear fender for $12, the replacement seat for $8, the repaint in 1994. He'd kept rough records, not perfect ones. The parts total over 18 years came to somewhere between $600 and $700, depending on how carefully you counted. Call it $700 to be conservative. His labor he didn't count. He'd worked on the tractor the way he worked on everything, because it needed doing, and he was capable of doing it. And paying someone else to do what he could do himself was a practice he'd never adopted and didn't intend to start. His labor was his own, and he didn't put a price on it in transactions like this. So total out, roughly $750, including the purchase price. What he received for the tractor in October of 2005 was substantially more than $750. He didn't tell people the exact number, and the collector who bought it was similarly private about what he'd paid, which is common in transactions of this kind. But the people in Defiance County farming community who heard about it second and third hand, the way things always get heard in small communities, were not dealing in small numbers when they talked about it. Dubois heard about it. He was 81 years old by then, still sharp, still farming a reduced operation with the help of his son. He drove past Walter's place one afternoon not long after the sale and stopped at the end of the lane. Walter came out to see what he needed. Dubois sat in his truck and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "I heard you sold that old red tractor." Walter said he had. Dubois nodded. He looked at the barn, where the spot where the Farmall had stood for 18 years was now occupied by a different machine. He looked back at Walter. "I told you to scrap it for 20, he said. "I remember," Walter said. Dubois nodded again. He didn't say anything else for a while. The engine of his truck idled in the quiet country road. Finally he said, "What did you see in it that I didn't?" Walter thought about that honestly. "I don't know that I saw something special in it," he said. "I just didn't decide it was worthless before I looked at it." Dubois chewed on that. Then he put his truck in drive. "Same thing," he said, and pulled away. Part 8. The longer story. Here is the thing that Walter would tell you if you asked him, and he's been asked many times since. In feed stores and at farm shows and at church and at the kind of community gatherings where the story has been told and retold until it has taken on the particular smooth quality of a story that has been handled many times. He would tell you that the tractor was not the point. The money was not the point either, though he used it well. Paid off the last of his operating line, which he'd been carrying for years and had come to dislike, and put the remainder toward a parcel of ground that came available the following year and that he'd been wanting for 20 years. The ground is the point, he'd say. The money just turned into ground, the way money should when you're a farmer. The point, he'd tell you, is about attention. He grew up in a time when men fixed things, not because fixing things was romantic, or because they were trying to make a statement about self-reliance, or because they'd read something in a magazine about the virtues of working with your hands. They fixed things because things needed fixing, and the alternative was paying someone else to do it or not having the thing at all. And neither of those alternatives was acceptable. So you learned to fix things and you got competent at it, and that competence was simply part of being a functional adult in a rural community. And part of fixing things, a necessary part, an unavoidable part, is paying attention to what you're fixing. You can't repair an engine without understanding how it works. You can't diagnose a fuel system problem without knowing what the system is supposed to do. You can't look at a seized-up $50 tractor and decide whether it's worth $50 without understanding what you're looking at. He paid attention to his tractor for 18 years. He knew that machine the way you know something you've maintained and used and thought about over a long time. He knew its serial number and its production history and its engine specification, not because he was a historian or a collector, but because he'd read about it in the course of trying to understand what he had. The way you do when you're a careful person who takes the things in his care seriously. The knowledge was just there, accumulated over years, waiting to be useful. The tractor wasn't a lottery ticket. It was a consequence. The consequence of buying something that others had dismissed, of doing the work to make it functional, of paying attention to what it was while you used it, and of being the kind of man who doesn't decide something is worthless just because everyone around him has decided it is. Part 9. What happened? After the farm that Walter Grubb operates today is not the same farm he inherited in 1985. It's larger. He's added ground steadily over the years, the way his neighbors watched without expecting, the way a man adds to a thing when he understands what the thing is for. The operating debt he carried for years is gone. The note on the ground he bought with the tractor money has been paid off. Sandra still runs the kitchen with the same precision she always has. Their son, Marcus, came back to the farm in 2008 after a stint in Columbus that had given him enough of cities to last him the rest of his life. Marcus farms alongside his father now, has learned the operation from the ground up, the way Walter learned it. Not in an agricultural college classroom, though there's nothing wrong with that, but in the fields and the barn and the equipment yard, watching how a man who understands what he's doing goes about his work. Walter is 68 now. He doesn't work as hard as he used to, which is what a farming community means when it says a man is healthy, that he's worked hard enough for long enough that he can afford to slow down and the farm still runs. He still drives a tractor. He still fixes things himself when fixing them himself is the sensible option. He still maintains his equipment, though he'll tell you the new stuff doesn't reward maintenance the way the old stuff did, which is a whole separate conversation. He doesn't own the Farmall 400 anymore, but he knows where it is. The collector who bought it lives in a community about 40 miles away, and Walter has been to see it twice since the sale. Once when the collector had it displayed at a regional antique show, once when he was in the area and stopped by just to look. It's been properly restored, the way serious collectors restore things. Not altered, but documented and preserved and cared for. The serial numbers are recorded in an IH historical registry. There's a plaque with its provenance. It's been written about in 2 antique tractor publications. Walter looked at it for a long time on his last visit. The old diesel engine, the wide front axle, the IH red paint that was now correct and clean. He looked at the seat, a proper seat, not the burlap stuffed original he'd found it with, not the $8 replacement he'd installed, but a correctly restored period unit. He thought about the $50. He thought about the trouble light in the cold barn. He thought about the feed store receipt. The collector came and stood beside him. "Does it feel strange?" the collector asked. "Seeing it like this?" Walter considered it honestly. "No," he said. "It feels right. It's in the right place now." He paused, looking at the tractor. "For a while my barn was the right place. For a working farm it was the right tractor. Now it's something else, and this is the right place for what it is." The collector nodded. He understood that. He was a man who'd spent his life finding old iron that had passed through the hands of working farmers and had arrived at the end of their working lives as something to be preserved rather than used, and he understood the distinction Walter was making. Most men, the collector said, would have sold it the minute they found out what it was. Walter put his hands in his coat pockets. "I would have," he said, "if I'd known the minute I found out. It took me 6 months to decide. I had to make sure I was doing it for the right reasons." The collector looked at him. "What were the right reasons?" Walter was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the collection barn, another visitor was walking through, and you could hear their footsteps on the concrete floor and their voice asking a question of someone. It had earned what it was going to become. Walter said finally, "It worked for 18 years before I sold it. I didn't just find it and flip it. It ran my farm for 18 years and earned every dollar. That felt right. Selling it the day I found out what it was, that would have felt like something different." He left the collection that afternoon and drove home through the October country, the fields stripped and brown after harvest. The sky that flat gray that Ohio puts on in October like a jacket it wears for 5 months. He drove past the places he knew, the farms of people he'd farmed beside for decades, the fields that had been his and his father's and his uncle's before him. He pulled in his lane and parked the truck and sat for a minute looking at the barn. Different tractor in there now. A 1998 IH he'd bought used, a machine that did everything the 400 had done and more besides. Practical, competent, not particularly interesting. He got out and went inside for supper. Epilogue: What $50 buys. There is a lesson in this story that the people who hear it most often take away wrong. They hear, "Buy old tractors, they might be valuable." That's not the lesson. That's the lottery version of the lesson. The version where you're hoping to get lucky, to stumble across something valuable that nobody else recognized, to win a prize for walking through the right sale yard on the right morning. That version of the lesson leads to barns full of broken machinery and the particular kind of optimism that never quite connects with reality. The real lesson is quieter and less exciting and more demanding. It goes like this: pay attention to the things you're responsible for. Do the work to understand what you have before you decide what it's worth. Don't take other people's conclusions as your own when those conclusions are based on how something looks rather than what it is. Maintain the things in your care. Read the serial number. Walter Grubb bought a seized-up $50 tractor that everyone at that sale had already dismissed, brought it home, spent a cold January getting it running, and then used it for 18 years. He paid attention to it while he used it. He learned what it was. He made a good decision about what to do with that knowledge when the time came. That's not luck. That's character. And character, unlike luck, is something you can actually build. One cold January morning at a time, one seized engine at a time, one $50 decision at a time. The tractor is in a collection now. The money long since turned into ground. The ground is producing. The son is learning the operation. The story goes on the way good stories do. Not with an ending, but with a continuation. The next generation picking up where the last one left off. The farm adding another year to the account. The fields going in and coming up and going in again. Somewhere out there right now, at some county farm sale, there is a tractor at the end of the line. Everybody there has already decided it's worthless. Maybe it is. But maybe the man who's willing to pay attention, who's willing to park it in his barn and spend a cold January with a trouble light and a feed store receipt, maybe that man knows something the crowd doesn't. Or maybe he just hasn't decided yet. And sometimes, that's enough. End. Expanded section. Part 3. Continuation. The machine earns its keep. There is a rhythm to a working farm that people who haven't lived it don't quite understand. It isn't the romantic rhythm of seasons that magazines write about, the hopeful spring planting, the tense summer watching, the triumphant fall harvest. That rhythm exists, but it sits inside a more granular one, a day-to-day cadence of maintenance and observation, and small decisions that add up over years into something that either holds together or doesn't. Walter Grubb understood this rhythm the way he understood his own breathing, not consciously, not philosophically, but practically, in his hands and his schedule and the way he organized his days. The Farmall 400 fit into this rhythm in a particular way. In the spring, it pulled the planter. In early summer, it pulled the cultivator through the young corn before the canopy closed. In the fall, it pulled the grain wagon behind the combine, back and forth across the fields, moving the harvest from where it was cut to where it needed to go. In between, it did the miscellaneous work that always accumulates on a farm, moving equipment, scraping the barn lot, pulling the feed wagon to the cattle. For a tractor Walter had paid $50 for, it was earning a substantial paycheck. He kept a rough log of the machine's hours, not a formal record, but a habit he had of writing the hour meter reading on the inside cover of whatever small notebook he was carrying at the time. By 1993, 6 years after the purchase, the 400 had added somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 hours to whatever it had accumulated under Earl Meyer's ownership. By 1998, another 1,500 on top of that. The engine showed no sign of concerning wear. The compression was solid. The diesel consumption was appropriate for the load. He mentioned this once to a young man who worked part-time for him during a particularly busy spring, a college student from town who was studying agricultural business and had taken the job for the practical experience. The young man looked at the 400 and asked, with the particular directness of a person who has learned to question things without yet having learned to be tactful about it, whether it was worth fixing and maintaining an old tractor like that when you could finance a newer, more capable machine. Walter thought about how to answer that honestly. A new 80-horsepower tractor with a cab and air conditioning and a radio, he said, financed at current rates, is going to cost me somewhere around $1,200 a month. That's $14,400 a year every year, whether I use it or whether it sits in the barn because I'm waiting on parts, or or the crop price is down and I can't afford to plant. He paused. This tractor cost me $50 and about $700 in parts over 6 years. It doesn't cost me anything to own it when I'm not using it. The young man considered this. But it's less capable, he said. For some things. Walter agreed. For the things I use it for, it's exactly as capable as I need it to be. The young man went back to work, and Walter drove the 400 out to the field, and the conversation ended there. But he thought about it that night, the way you think about conversations that touched something you believe but haven't put into words recently. The point wasn't nostalgia. He wasn't keeping the 400 because it reminded him of his father's farm, or because he was sentimentally attached to the International Harvester brand, or because he had romantic ideas about old iron. He kept it because it worked and it was paid for. And those two things together created a margin in his operation that newer and shinier and more capable machines on payment plans would have eroded. Margin was how farms survived. Not the dramatic things, not the brilliant crop year or the lucky land purchase or the one-time windfall, but the quiet accumulation of margin, year after year, built from 100 small decisions that each added a little or saved a little, decisions that most people didn't notice and that didn't make for a story you'd tell at a gathering, but that compounded over decades into the difference between a farm that made it and one that didn't. The 400 was a margin machine. That was its real value, before anyone knew about the serial number or the demonstration program or the provenance. Its real value was what it didn't cost. Expanded section, Part 5. Continuation, Conversations at a Distance. The collector's visit in the fall of 2003 was not the only conversation Walter had in those years about the tractor's possible significance. There had been others, smaller, less conclusive, but part of the same slow accumulation of information that was building in the background of his farming life. In 1996, he'd subscribed, almost by accident, to a small newsletter published by an IH historical group out of Illinois. He'd seen it mentioned in a farm magazine, sent in the subscription price on a whim, and started receiving the quarterly publication. It was dense reading, full of production data and serial number research, and debates about which casting marks indicated which foundry, and what the differences between early and late production units of various models actually meant in practical terms. Most of it he absorbed slowly, cross-referencing what he read against what he knew about his own tractor. In the fall 1997 issue, there was an article about the Farmall 400, specifically about the 1955 model year production and the characteristics that distinguished early production units. Walter read it 3 times. He went out to the barn and checked 3 specific things the article mentioned. 2 of them matched his tractor precisely. The third required a measurement he didn't have a reference for, so he wrote to the newsletter editor, a retired IH dealer from Champaign, Illinois, named Porter, and asked for clarification. Porter wrote back in 2 weeks. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, detailed, and clearly the product of a man who had been waiting years for someone to ask him the right questions. Porter confirmed the measurement reference, asked for Walter's serial number, and when Walter provided it in a follow-up letter, replied with a response that was notably more excited in tone than anything that had come before it. "Your number," Porter wrote, "falls within a range I have been tracking for 11 years. I have documented 6 units in this range with confirmed early production characteristics. Yours would be the 7th. I would very much like to visit your farm if that is agreeable to you." Walter wrote back and said it was agreeable. Porter came in the spring of 1998. He was 67, retired, drove a van with a half-dozen IH publications on the passenger seat and a camera on the back seat. He spent 4 hours with the tractor. At the end of 4 hours, he sat down on the same 5-gallon bucket that the collector from Van Wert would later use, and he told Walter in precise terms what he believed he was looking at. It was Porter who first mentioned the demonstration program. He had documentary evidence, photocopied dealer bulletins from 1955, internal IH communications that had surfaced through the historical group's research over the years that identified a specific small-batch production run for dealer demonstration purposes. The engines in this batch had been assembled to a tighter tolerance than standard production, and were intended to serve as showcases for the reliability and performance of IH's diesel technology at a time when many farmers were still skeptical of diesel power. Porter believed Walter's tractor was one of these. He couldn't prove it conclusively without additional documentation, which is why he encouraged Walter to write to the Case IH Historical Records Office, which Walter did and received the confirming letter some months later. Porter photographed the tractor from every angle. He measured several components and recorded the measurements in his notebook. Before he left, he told Walter that he intended to include the tractor in an article he was preparing for the newsletter with Walter's permission. Walter gave permission. The article ran in the fall 1998 newsletter. He read it twice and then put it in the folder with the other tractor documents, which was getting thick by then. The original feed store receipt, the letter from Case IH Historical Records, the correspondence with Porter, print copies of the newsletter articles, the service records he'd kept. He went about his farming. He told Sandra about Porter's visit. He told her what Porter had said about the significance of the tractor. Sandra listened, asked a couple of questions, and then said, "What are you going to do with that information?" Walter thought about it. "Keep farming," he said. Sandra nodded. That was a sensible answer. She went back to whatever she'd been doing. He kept farming for 5 more years before the collector from Van Wert at the farm show brought the conversation back to a point where a decision had to be made. Expanded section. Part 8. Continuation. The community processes. Its small communities have their own way of handling stories that don't fit the expectations they had for the person at the center of them. The usual pattern is this: initial skepticism, followed by grudging acknowledgement, followed by the quiet revision of memory that allows people to say afterward that they always knew there was something to that they'd seen something in him early on that suggested this outcome was possible. Walter Grubb's community went through this process with the particular efficiency of people who had known him all their lives and were therefore both better and worse at revising their memories of him. Du Bois, as mentioned, stopped by and asked what Walter had seen in it. That conversation was important to Du Bois. You could tell from how carefully he'd framed the question that he'd been working up to it for a while. He was 81 and had been farming since before Walter was born and had spent 60 years being right about most things farming related, and the tractor had been a notable exception. He needed to understand the exception in order to accommodate it into his worldview. Walter's answer, that he hadn't seen something special in it, that he just refused to decide it was worthless before he looked at it, was an honest answer. Du Bois's response, that this was the same thing, was also honest, and probably the most accurate summary of the whole story that anyone produced. Others processed it differently. There were a few men who took the lesson as license to start buying up old machinery on the theory that any of it might be valuable, which missed the lesson entirely and resulted in at least 2 barns in the county becoming significantly more cluttered than they'd been before without producing any notable returns. Walter heard about this with a feeling he didn't quite have a name for. Something between amusement and mild distress, because he could see the reasoning and knew exactly how it went wrong. The lesson wasn't old things are valuable. The lesson was about attention and judgment, and those aren't transferable by story. You can hear the story and understand it intellectually and still not have the patience to sit in a cold barn in January with a trouble light. Still not have the discipline to maintain something over 18 years without letting it slide. Still not have the capacity to accumulate and apply knowledge without an obvious immediate payoff. Walter didn't say any of this to the people who asked him about it. It would have sounded like he was claiming a virtue he happened to possess, which is a bad look even when it's accurate. He just answered the questions people asked and let them take from the story what they were going to take. His son Marcus, who was 12 in 2005 when the tractor sold and old enough to understand the broad outlines of what had happened, understood it better than most. He'd grown up watching his father maintain that tractor. He'd ridden on it as a young child, had been taught to drive it as a teenager, had helped with some of the maintenance work over the years in the way that farm kids help, partially learning by doing, absorbing competence by proximity. He asked his father once, after the sale, whether he regretted selling it. Walter thought about that carefully before answering. He thought about the 6 months he'd taken to make the decision, the reasoning he'd worked through, the conversation with the collector about why it felt right. No, he said. It had become what it was going to become. The right thing was to let it go to where that could be recognized and preserved properly. Marcus nodded. He was 15 then, old enough to understand most of it. Then he asked a follow-up question that Walter wasn't expecting. Would you do it again? Buy another $50 tractor at a sale? Walter looked at his son. If I saw one that was worth looking at, he said, and I had the barn space and the time and the inclination to look at it properly. Yeah, I'd do it again. Even if it turned out to be worth $50? Especially then, Walter said. If it ran and worked and earned its keep, a $50 tractor is a good investment at $50. You don't need it to be worth a fortune. You just need it to be worth what you paid for it. Marcus went quiet, absorbing that. Walter could see him turning it over. But you have to know what you paid for it, Marcus said finally. That's right, Walter said. You have to know what you paid for it, and you have to know what it's worth. And the only way to know either of those things is to pay attention. Marcus nodded. He understood that. He went back to work. The farm went on. The seasons turned. The fields went in and came up and were harvested and went in again. Walter Grubb drove his other tractors across his own ground, and his son drove beside him, learning the way his father had learned, by doing and by watching and by paying attention to the things that were in their care. The Farmall 400 sat in a collection barn 40 miles away, documented and preserved, its story recorded in the registry of an IH historical organization. Somewhere in that documentation, in the provenance file that the collector maintained with the careful precision of a man who understands that history matters, there is a copy of a feed store receipt, yellowed and creased, with a serial number written on the back in pencil and a repair list written in the same hand. The receipt is from 1987. The pencil marks are faint but legible. They are the beginning of the whole story.